internet issues. So just be aware, she'll pop in and out, but that's why you're not seeing her live beautiful face today. My name is Melissa Spaden. I'm Director System of Supports with Learning and Leadership Services. And my wonderful colleague Felicia joins us from the other side of the house, the Director System of Supports with Student Services and Programs. Felicia, did you want to pop on?
Yeah, am I choppy still?
A little bit. Little robot.
Okay, well, hi everyone. I'm glad you could be here today. I'm going to let Melissa take the lead today. But as always, we acknowledge the land, and we've been coming together now for, if you've been with us since last year, the routine, what we're doing. But again, the push is always to go beyond acknowledgement and move towards learning, right? And building our own knowledge and honoring the original inhabitants of the land. And I'm actually in Tennessee, which is Chickasaw Nation. I think, Melissa, is that your family?
It is.
Your husband's nation?
Chickasaw.
Yeah. And I have that as well on my dad's side. So this is where I am, but because we're virtual, we just want to take a moment to honor where any of us may be resting our feet and be committed to doing our.
So as Felicia said, where you're resting your feet, we're going to do a quick breathing exercise because we know it's difficult to transition from one topic to another. And so if you want to take a moment to get your feet on the ground, I apologize for those of you shorter individuals for whom that is not a possibility in your current desk chair. But if you want to get your feet as close to the ground as they can be, let me let people in. Just going to take a moment. And follow your breath. Notice how your body feels and how it changes as you're working through this inhale and exhale. Let's do one more cycle. Okay, thank you all for taking that moment. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we have these community agreements because we'll be having conversations that require us to be bold and speak our truth. So our community agreements, we assume goodwill. We're fully present. We share the air. So if one of your colleagues is a little quieter and you want to bring out, some contributions they might have, please make sure to do that. Listen and speak from the heart. Stay curious. Breathe and take care of yourself. We don't get that opportunity very often, and it's important to listen to your body. And then tell your own story. So if you'd like to share something that someone else has shared, make sure it's okay with them first, because sometimes when we're talking about social emotional learning and doing some reflection, some of those reflections might be a little bit more personal. And if you're new, when we share out anything that might be personal, we stop the recording as well, so that we can make sure to have a safe space for everyone. And just as a reminder, we always use the SEL 3 signature practices. If you'd like to learn more about that, there's an entire folder on our agenda. And the 3 signature practices are what we think of as a really easy way to integrate SEL into your meetings, into your classes, anywhere that you'll be talking with others and interacting with others. So we start with a welcoming activity. We have some engaging practices with attentive listening, which we'll have today. And then we end with an optimistic closure, which is reflections, looking forward. It doesn't mean positive, but it means that we're looking forward. So today's topic is assessment. And if you know me at all, you know this, as Felicia said, this is my jam. I love assessment. I always am thinking about it and how measurement is just, it's so interesting to me, all the ways that we measure. And so Felicia found this beautiful quote from Einstein: everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. Everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. Right now, my son is learning about the count. So everything he counts is followed with a ha, 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 and it's delightful. But it makes me think a lot about what do we try to measure and what's the why behind it. So our breakout that we're going to be doing today for our welcoming activity, we're going to go into a breakout room for just a few minutes, and you can meet. You will find, introduce yourselves, talk about what you do, and then think about this question: what do you wish you could measure? What would you like to quantify or make tangible? And remember, this is, the world of possibility. So what would you want to measure or make something quantifiable or tangible? So take a moment to do that. Think, you could write down, and I'm going to move us into breakouts. And I believe it will be for about 5 minutes. Let me just make sure my settings are there. Okay. There we go. Explore the many different purposes for SEL assessments. We're going to engage in an assessment experience and then also understand the decision-making process to either select or create appropriate SEL assessments. So just a real quick response in the chat. Tell me how you feel about assessment. Y'all know I'm number one, so just get a gauge for everyone in the room. Pick a number. Okay, I see some ones. That makes me happy. Some 7, we got 4, 2. Okay, so we have a good variety. So we have some people who love assessment, some people who hate it, a little bit of in between, which is good to know going forward because we're going to be thinking about assessment in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the most interesting things, at least what I find interesting about SEL assessment. But we're also coming at this from an MTSS framing, which is important because without context, none of the assessment matters. So MTSS, we just want to remind ourselves, MTSS is an integrated comprehensive framework, and it aligns academic, behavioral, and social emotional learning in a fully integrated system. So when we're looking at SEL, we're not looking at it in isolation, we're looking at SEL in concert with academic and behavioral outcomes. And so the idea is that we are creating systematic change and systemic change through intentional design and redesign. So we want to have that information, like Bonner mentioned, quickly, and we want to be able to identify the needs that arise and provide the supports necessary for those students. And so when we look at our MTSS framework, again, what we're really talking about trying to measure right here is getting some of that input information about transformative SEL instruction, mental health, maybe some behavioral, although that's often more of the outcome, so that we can better support them in their academics, because students aren't going to learn if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel comfortable, and they don't feel supported. And we know that the data supports that. So with that, could I get someone to unmute and define assessment for us? Any brave?
Assessment is the process of systematically, gathering information to inform education-related decisions. And data use is the practice of using data or information to inform practice at the individual level or at the program site or organizational level to drive improvements in practice.
Thank you, Lila. And what we like to emphasize when we talk about data is folks think data equals numbers. Data is just information, right? We're looking at evidence, we're trying to find information and trying to solve those problems or get answers to some of the questions that we have. So we assess constantly. We assess what is in the refrigerator to make for dinner. We are constantly gathering information to make decisions. It's just that we're talking more about assessment in relation to education. And so I want to start with this framing as well. We need to think about guarding ourselves against bias. We need to assess for sound reasons. And that's why a lot of our student level data ends up being aggregated, because we want to make sure that we're protecting privacy and we're considering the strengths of youth and adults, right? We're not assessing for SEL to look for deficits. We're not trying to fix people. We're trying to figure out what needs are arising either in our classrooms, in our schools, our sites, and our system as well. And then those assessing must be clear on the why, the what, and to what end they're assessing. Otherwise, we can be assessing through a deficit lens. So again, we're not looking for gaps, we're not looking for problems. And you might see that language out in the assessment world because it's a slow world to change. So the other thing that I want to make clear is that when you are assessing, people need to know the why behind it, right? And I think that's one thing that Bonner mentioned, is getting students to understand how and why the data will be used. And so the idea is that data is only used to help and empower youth. It's not to violate their privacy. If the survey is supposed to be anonymous, it better be anonymous. Otherwise, that trust will be gone. And so considering those equity implications of interpreting and sharing data. So again, it's important to come from an assets lens. But when it's transparent and accessible, I know many of you have done things like data summits led by students or student-led conversations or youth panels when it comes to data. And that's when it becomes empowering to youth and family. It can help drive change. It can help see the needs that are arising and ways for students and families to better have change or input for better results. And so I want to just offer this as a resource. It is linked in the agenda. I'm a huge fan of this. We made a beautiful version of it. But just like we all have a right to our own privacy and our data, we say that students have certain assessment rights. So if they're taking an assessment, if you're trying to put out a student survey, they are entitled to know the purpose for it. Why am I taking this? And how are the results going to be used? And who's going to be using those results? What is being reflected in here? If you're measuring SEL, are you trying to call out what I'm not good at? Or are there going to be scoring guides? Is it going to be something that I have to do makeup work for afterwards? They also need to know what the differences are between good and bad performance on that. And then quality assessment. So I think we've all taken an assessment once in our life that we knew was not very good quality. And as you're going through that process, realizing it's not good quality, your investment in that work goes down, down, down. And so if students know that this is sound, that it is valid, that it's not just another thing being thrown at them, they're more likely to invest in that. And then last piece, and something that we've been working on with some teams, is the effective communication of their results. So if you are going to be doing an SEL survey and students aren't going to get their own results, it needs to be clear how that information will be communicated, how it will be used, and make sure that families and students are clear in how that information is going to be communicated. And so I strongly encourage, as we're going through this process, to think about the why and to think about how you communicate this to the users, the people who are taking this survey, especially if you're looking for triangulated data between staff, students, and families. Oops, that went backwards. So I wanted to show this quick video. It feels pretty random to me, but there is a huge conversation going on worldwide about social emotional learning, about measurement and how to measure SEL. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that this worldwide conversation filled with experts in measurement, in social emotional learning, and in psychometrics, everybody's still sort of trying to figure it out. And so I just wanted to highlight this conversation, and then we'll have a brief takeaway afterwards.
There is no universal test for social and emotional skills. There's not one topic or one criteria. What works in one context is not going to work in the other.
Very often what we're finding is that students who have not begun to show academic skills or their intellectual abilities, in part because they've been placed in environments that don't support and nurture their social and emotional strengths. These are very often referred to as late bloomers, or people who are placed in the proper situation or a suitable situation, I should say, one that's compatible with their intellect, will then begin to develop these talents.
So it's being able to assess SEL skills in tandem with the academic actually creates a more equitable assessment space, so that, as you said, the students you characterize as late bloomers have time to show, you know, their expertise, which may have developed at a different speed.
Yeah.
So it gets to the very heart of this topic of assessment and social justice.
We live in a society where we have to afford some type of generalization. The key is, in my opinion, to understand which of these components we can begin to evaluate more systematically. For example, you take arithmetic. And I think that one of the issues now is that we don't completely understand these social and emotional skills. And so we can't simply have a evaluation that fits. And I don't know if there ever will be one, probably not. But I think that by studying them, we can distill some components of them that we can have a standardized metric for.
So from the mouths of experts, any thoughts about that? About that conversation they had? This was, if you want to watch the full one, I think it was about 5 hours. It's a 2-day meeting and 5 hours total. But I just thought it was really interesting, talking about juxtaposing academics with social emotional and the why behind it. Any other thoughts?
There is no universal test for social and emotional skills.
So I also wanted to emphasize that, as mentioned, there's no, as she started saying again, there's no universal test. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of SEL assessments and how to ensure that you are following, proper thinking protocols, but know that there's no one right way. It's going to depend on the specific circumstance, the specific environment, and what you're also trying to accomplish.
There is no universal test for
There we go. So I'd love to offer up this 10 practitioner beliefs from making SEL assessment work. It's a great way to start the conversation with colleagues and thinking through this process before you engage in this conversation, and ensuring that you're all trying to work towards the same goal. So figuring out what your vision will be for measuring SEL, looking towards strengths, ensuring that there's positive culture and climate, using an equity lens, recognizing the importance of adult social emotional competence. And that's one piece that often gets left out. We focus a lot on students, but again, the teachers, the staff, everyone who experiences the system are the ones who are making up this system. And it's important to know how they're experiencing it as well and contributing to it. Measuring for growth, not an endpoint. So for once, you're not setting an endpoint goal, you're looking for growth and improvement. Fostering adult capacity. And so that's another need that's going to arise. If you see that, if you decide to do a readiness assessment, and it seems that folks don't have a very firm understanding about what social emotional learning is, you're going to need to grow their capacity and understanding. Authentic engagement of youth and families and collaboration. Again, parents want to know what social emotional learning is as well. Using that data to continually improve, and then implementing universal and differentiated approaches to developing SEL. And again, it really depends on the context. So those of you who are in larger districts, you might have one assessment for everyone. but there might be follow-up assessments that are dependent on specific sites, because what you're going to need at a middle school might be different than a high school, especially some of our special sites. So just really quickly to start off with, I want to just make sure everybody is on the same page with some of these definitions. And if you go to the link here, it's also on the agenda. This is going to be the foundation of the conversation for the next few parts. And there are really overall 4 types of social emotional learning assessments that we use. And I hear these unfortunately used interchangeably, and it's important to point out that an assessment's only valid when you're using the data what it's intended for, right? And so we want to think about why we're doing this. So we have screeners, we have those accountability or outcome assessments that we're required to do. We have program evaluation or implementation, and then SEL competency assessments. So really quickly in the chat, if you don't mind just putting in there which type you're really thinking about doing or learning more about or trying to implement or improve in your district. It's a wide variety. Wonderful. Great. Well, I'm glad I prepared information on all 4 types. All 4. Perfect. So many of you are familiar with screeners for different purposes, probably most likely academic screeners or behavioral screeners. And so basically this is, you're trying to do this early on before implementing something or just to get a foundation. It's especially helpful for new students. And it's just overall general behaviors, strengths, and any needs that they might have. And so it's really useful, obviously, for individual supports and intervention, but it's also great for having patterns. So if you're noticing that specific needs are popping up in a specific grade level, then you can provide more support there. It might be where you want to target your school-based mental health professionals more. Maybe you need additional curriculum or supports for those areas. And then it's also helpful for just that tier 1 whole class instruction. If you notice that there is a lot of bullying and interpersonal conflict, then that's something that you would build in for everyone. Then we have accountability and outcome assessments. I know a lot of you on this call are very familiar with that. That is some of our information that's used maybe for your LCAP, for a SIPSA, for an improvement goal that you might have. They're typically large scale. They're often point in time, often end of year. A lot of you are probably about to do the Healthy Kids survey as well. And it's supposed to just measure the current state and see if there's any improvement year to year overall. You can also do a pre-post and have, you know, that outcome at the end and you measure it against the beginning. But that's often including climate data from educational partners for the LCAP, for SIPSAs, for accountability purposes. And a lot of that is also, you're required to do it, so you do it. Implementation assessments, we see this less. Program implementation, we see less in SEL and evaluation. But really when you're implementing a new program, a practice, or a system, you want to know if it's working, right? And so if you adopt in a new curriculum and you're teaching this new curriculum, how are you going to know if it's working? It's great to have qualitative data from people. That's really important, but you also want to have some measures that will show if there's any change in what you're trying to do. And if you don't have that information, then it's really hard to justify continuing that. And I always think as well, from the financial perspective, it's hard to justify the cost, whatever that might be, whether it's human or overall just financial costs. So you might have fidelity of implementation of that practice. So are people teaching the lessons the way they're supposed to be taught? Are students actually engaging in the conversations? All of those pieces. The way recipients experience the practice. So do students feel like there's an improvement? Do they enjoy these lessons? It's really hard to see improvement in SEL if students hate the lessons that they're doing. And then measures of success like improvement in well-being data, often academic performance. It's hard to find correlation, especially causation, but sometimes you can see some of those changes if that intervention is really targeted in specific classes. And then the last one is the most talked about. I won't say it's the most exciting, but it's definitely one of the most interesting areas. And it's one that requires a lot of investment in the human capital in your system. And competency assessments, they're supposed to measure strengths, needs, identify systematic needs related to teaching and learning of SEL competencies. But they can also be used to determine adult needs and strengths for coaching, for support. We really we advocate for triangulating that and matching that data. So if you're asking certain questions of students, see if you can take those questions and ask the adults the same thing so that you're building capacity collectively. And so they can be used summatively, but we're really trying to get to the point where we're collecting that data formatively so that we can monitor that progress. I hate the term autopsy, but when you're just looking at summative data, it's too late to help. And so instead, you try to gather data in ways that you can help understand what needs are arising, what is improving, and what supports you might need to give as interventions along the way. So now that I've talked for way too long, we're going to take a moment and experience some assessment. So this is specifically a competency assessment. It's related to the way Castle has phrased it, the SEL competencies right now. This is from 2020, but it's very applicable still at the moment. And so I want you're going to take a few minutes and take the self-assessment and reflect. And then we're going to go into the groups that you were in before. We might move a few people around so that some of the groups are slightly smaller, and talk about how this could be used with adults, with students, and how could you use this data. So I'm going to make sure, does everybody have the link? Let me copy it. It's going to ask you to make a copy because we don't need to say everybody's business. And so take 2 to 3 minutes. I'm going to say take 3 minutes. Fill it out. You just put the X's in, and then there's a reflection. And Layla, I want you to know that your background is really hard to look at because Lupita Nyong'o just makes me feel inadequate. So, and then Michelle Obama right over your shoulder staring at me saying, do better, do better.
You are becoming, in the words of Michelle Obama.
You are becoming.
So take a minute, reflect, and then we're gonna go into rooms in just a few minutes. Go through the last component. Thank you for joining us, Bill.
Take care, Bill.
Mo had to leave earlier too because he had karate. Hopefully you're doing something fun as well.
Thank you.
so we're gonna go through this decision-making process. And I phrase it this way because I wanted to take it away from just simply being technical, which is amazing. I know assessment people not wanting to just be technical, but I want to make sure that we're keeping the human component in this conversation, because if we're really trying to understand social emotional well-being of people, that is a human aspect. And like Felicia said, our lives are constantly changing right now. And so keeping that in mind as well. And so this is really a decision-making process. I encourage you to gather folks who will be involved in that decision-making to go through this. And when I was looking through some of the SEL videos, assessment-related videos, shocker, there's not many. This quote just popped out at me. What's assessed is what's addressed. And so I like to frame it with that at the beginning. So our first question is, what are we trying to measure? And so once you've decided on the type of assessment that you're going to be administering, really, because that's what we do, you want to think about what you actually want to measure. And this is on your organizer, so you don't have to worry about all of this text, but it makes you think about, what are we actually trying to measure? What are we trying to learn? And then I like to go from an assets framing of, what data are we currently collecting? And when I engage in this conversation with districts, Luis and I are going through this right now at Sweetwater. Do the measures we have currently address what we're trying to get at, or what's missing? So maybe we have a question that on the surface is pretty good, but we need more information. So maybe we need to add some more layers to that question, or change the wording so that it really gets at what we're trying to learn. We also want to think ahead and think about how we're going to interpret the data. We're going to talk about it with others, whether or not we have a framework or standards or competencies you're trying to assess. And just as a note, if you've never checked out the California Transformative SEL competencies, they exist, they are CASEL aligned, and they're helpful to guide that conversation. And then also thinking about, are we trying to administer this to every student? Do we want student level information? Are we doing this for selected grades, classes? Are we doing a representative sample? Are we focusing on one site? And so really getting down to that information of the quantity of people and the level of data we actually want. And then the last piece, are the assessments we're considering developmentally appropriate for the youth we serve? Great point about making sure that you have a column there that gets at, maybe the student doesn't even understand the question. And so sometimes that's important. And if this is an assessment for littles who can't read yet, how is it going to be administered? Do you have the human power to administer that assessment to every single student? So once we figured out that what, or at least dove into that, we want to start thinking about the why. We're going to pause, and I'd love to hear from some folks about, why are we collecting this data? I mean, I know for the accountability, it's because we have to, right? But if we want to go beyond that, are we trying to collect this for actionable information? Is this something that our teachers are going to do something about next? Or will it be our school-based mental health professionals? Will it be something that as a leadership team we'll look at and think about, like human resource allocation? Maybe our third graders really need some extra support. Will it be something that we're using for communication? So we're simply going to gather this information and share it with others, or is it for that accountability? But it doesn't just have to be the state level, federal accountability. It could be holding ourselves accountable for targets that we've set, right? So think about the purpose behind it. And then what decisions are you trying to make with the data? This is that conversation that goes back to the alignment of what. So maybe you're trying to make a lot of decisions, and make sure that that information you're gathering can inform those decisions. So maybe you're trying to decide whether students have specific supports that they need. Maybe you're trying to do something like justify hiring more school counselors, or additional supports for students. So what decisions are you trying to make? And then what theory of action or change are we using? Do we have a theory of action? If we do these things, then we will see this growth. And so thinking through, what theory of change are we using? What theory of action contributes to that? And we have resources on all of these things as well to support this process. So I want to just take a moment and see if there's anybody who wants to share out, we've talked a little bit about the different types of assessments we're looking for, but thinking about what purpose or maybe what decisions are we trying to make right now with this data. So I know a lot of you are engaging in this work and thinking about what decisions are we trying to currently make.
I think for us, we're always kind of trying to say, if we do this, will our students then feel more this? Or if we continue doing this, is it going to produce an effect over here? Are they going to come to school more? Are they going to do better academically? Are they going to be more willing to engage with the curriculum? Are they going to be better advocates for themselves and their families? So we're continuing, in my mind, thinking of, apart from just the regular opportunities for like monitoring and maintenance, but do we keep doing this or do we do something different? Like, is what we're doing working, or should we try something else? So that's kind of the purpose. So it's kind of accountability, but it's also for actual practice, because it's kind of like, we change our program based on our student needs all the time. So this is a big need right now that everyone is saying, and we perceive that our students need it. So are we really making a difference, or are we just making ourselves feel good by thinking we are?
Thank you.
If I can jump in, I think it's also as this is new for a lot of us, and just as we dive deeper into it, just being transparent and letting our stakeholders know why we're doing it and how we are, like, are we growing? Are we developing in different ways that we weren't before? And, the discussion of taking time away academically to focus on other needs and why this is important. And I think that is another aspect of just communicating with our other partners to know why we're doing this and how it is supporting students and staff and all those around us.
Thank you, Melissa. I'll leave a pause in case there's anybody else. I'm going to feel like Melissa kind of segued us to our next with the who. And so the who is a multi-part question. Do we have the correct people in our decision-making team? And so I encourage you, I know SEL, a lot of you are often pigeonholed in SEL, but when you're creating some sort of assessment to measure SEL, you need folks from across your organization. So you want to ensure that there's equity and voice, that there's, when you're creating a survey or engaging with a company that pushes out a survey, you want to make sure that you have the technology folks on board as well. You need to understand the user experience as well when they're looking at the survey. There have been some that have been pushed out, and you look at it and wonder, you see that you have like 100 questions. Is this user friendly? And do we have enough people involved in this to think about what's the data reporting going to look like? Are we going to have to do a ton of legwork on the other end after it's over to try to make this data make sense? And then you also want to think about the decision makers at the table and make sure that they're also reflective of our students. And if they're not, bring some students into the conversation, especially if you're secondary. They will tell you honestly. It's never a bad idea to have a student panel. That's always my favorite. A kid will tell you the full truth, whether you ask for it or not, about with their opinion. And then ensuring that you are being sensitive to cultural differences as well. Because a question might be offensive to a student, or it might be, they might not want to answer it. If they don't understand the context and why this question is being asked of them. I think about some of our Healthy Kids surveys and how there's been parent pushback in certain parts. And some of the questions would be seen as offensive to some students. So thinking through that, ensuring that you have a lot of community input and educational partner input on some of those pieces. Then also, who's going to be making the decisions based on the data and how frequently? This will be in another part, but one of the things that we heard very often when we were talking to folks about how they're assessing for SEL in the past couple of years is we can't because we don't have the supports. So if we gather information and see student needs and we can't support those needs, then we're not doing anybody, a service. We're doing a major disservice. So who's going to be making the decisions? How frequently will these decisions be made? What changes will occur? And then this is my most important question always, who's going to take the next steps? When is it going to happen? How will we follow up? Making that calendar entry, because it might end up falling on you if it's by that assumption that is made. The where, these are often afterthoughts. Those of you who work in assessment consistently, you know that this is so important. Is there a central place for documenting and tracking this information? Are you adding another technology system onto all of your existing systems, or will this data feed into your system? Because if you're adding on another system, I can tell you your data and tech people will not be pleased. So you have to think about that feeding process, whether they're going to integrate in any way or whether you're adding on another layer. And then where's this data going to be shared publicly? Do you have your own sort of dashboard system? Is there an easy way of sharing the information, or is this adding another step and thinking about where will it be shared? Make sure you're talking to your communications folks or the people that run your website. And then the last few are really focused on the how. There's a lot of questions in this because this is the important part. How are we going to use this data? Are we going to use it consistently throughout the year? One thing that we've talked about is taking your big old summative assessment, whether it's Panorama, Core, Healthy Kids, whatever it is, pulling a couple questions that you just think are the most important and doing dipstick check-ins throughout the year on those questions only. How can we encourage multiple types of data? So yes, we're probably going to do quantitative measures, but how can we get some qualitative information to use? This is what I was sharing. Do we have the appropriate next steps and interventions? What questions are going to be targeted to tell us what those next steps will be that we need to take? What are those indicators? A few of you, this question, how will this be paid for? There's a lot of money out there right now, but make sure that whatever purchase is being made through a consistent budget because most of these companies won't give you a one-time paid for multi-year contract, but make sure that there's ongoing funding because you don't want to start something that you can't continue. And the last part of how that I touched upon, is this going to be in our system? Is it pushed out in someone else's system? How do we have access to that? If it's in someone else's system, my question is always how many people can have access to this information? How can we ensure that the people who need to use this have that access at any time? Do we have a way of visualizing this information? And then these last two parts is the communication. And the communication needs to happen before the assessment and then after. So how are you going to communicate the importance of gathering this information? And then afterwards, how are you going to share this? And I know timelines are always iffy, but I can tell you working with the public in communications, please try to give them a date range for something when the data will be out. And if you're not going to make that date range, communicate it ahead of time. And then that last part, how we ensure that our language is highlighting strengths and areas for growth and avoiding any stigmatizing language when we're communicating those results. I mean, we see this language slowly shifting, but when we talk about subgroups, what are subgroups? Sub of what? We're talking about students, people, student groups. And then thinking about when we talk about gaps, that there's tons of implications there. And so we're doing this, a lot of the outcomes that we're seeing with students are because of the inputs that our system is creating. So ensuring that the language that we use to discuss this, to communicate, that someone who has those communication strengths can put together even just a one-pager with talking points about this so that we're all on the same page. And so you don't have that cringe moment where someone else is reporting about the data and says something that you think, oh, I should not have said that. And then our last piece is our when. This is timeline for the selection, the adoption, the implementation, the reporting, and whether we've had time to really go through this process in depth. I'm a realist. I know how sometimes this is hurry up. Here's the money, go buy something quickly. But if you already have this system, how can you backtrack a little bit and make sure you've thought all of these pieces through? And then also thinking about our timelines for the assessment window. We don't want to do this when we're doing CASP, when we're doing AP testing, final exams, all of those other pieces, right before, right after spring break when students might not be present. And then if you're also doing this for parents and student or parents and teachers or staff, are you going to give them that time? Can you find a way to bring people to a computer to take this assessment or to the paper? You'll get greater reporting that way. And last part is, how quickly can that data be turned over if you're trying to do this formatively? A lot of our data takes a long time to turn around when it's large scale, and it doesn't help us. I'm not naming any names or saying any acronyms, but I'm sure you all know what we're talking about. So that's just the quick run through of this discussion and thinking protocol. Really, my goal is that this is something that you can have a conversation about as you're going through this process. You have something when a vendor comes to you and you have a bunch of questions to ask them, because it's always hard to think about ahead of time. And it's also a way to make sure that everybody in your organization is on the same page about what you're trying to do. So we're going to take a moment. As always, we want to have ample time at the end for Q&A or any specific comments, and to use the wisdom of the group. Okay, so I fear that I overwhelmed everyone with information. So I see a few people have to leave. If you could please give feedback, give us some feedback, and please be in touch with any next steps that you have or anything that we can support you with. I want to open it up for any questions people have, any thinking, any requests that there might be. And then I'll give you a little bit of self-care time. Take 10 minutes to stretch. Okay, that's fabulous. All right, thank you everyone for coming today. We will be talking next month about school-based mental health professionals, I believe.